My name is Nora Callahan, and I was 34 years old when my father died on a Tuesday morning in October, with my hand in his and his new wife's attorney on hold in the other room. He had been sick for 8 months, pancreatic cancer, the kind that moves fast and negotiates with nobody. The kind that takes a man who was still coaching youth baseball in the spring and has him unable to walk to the kitchen by August. My father, Robert Callahan, was 62 years old when he was diagnosed, and he handled the news the way he handled everything in his life, quietly, practically, with a list. He worked through that list one item at a time, without drama, without complaint, without letting anyone see how frightened he was until the very end, when he could not hide it any more and simply stopped trying. Before I tell you what was in that will, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time below. I love knowing where you are when you listen to this. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. My father built Callahan Construction with his own hands, starting at 26 with 1 truck, 2 employees, and a contract to renovate a single office building downtown. By the time he was 50, he had 40 employees, a reputation that preceded him in 3 counties, and a business that was worth more than either of us ever said out loud, because saying it out loud felt like tempting something. He was not a showy man. He drove the same truck for 11 years. He took his lunch to work in a cooler my mother had bought him for their 10th anniversary. He knew every employee by name and by the names of their children, and he showed up to their weddings and their funerals and their retirement parties without being asked, because he believed that a business was only as good as the people inside it, and that the people inside it needed to know they were seen. My mother was the other half of everything. Ellen Callahan ran the household and the books and my father's schedule and the volunteer committee at the school and 3 other things I am probably forgetting. All of it simultaneously and without visible effort, the way truly capable people make hard things look like nothing. She died on a Wednesday morning in March, a stroke that came without warning while she was making coffee. My father found her. He never fully described what that was like, and I never asked, because some things belong only to the person who lived them. What I know is that he was not the same after. Not broken exactly, more like a building that had lost a load-bearing wall, still standing, still functional, but reorganized around an absence that was always there, even when you were not looking directly at it. He grieved for 14 months. Then Claudette March appeared at a charity dinner and looked at my father like he was the most interesting man in the room, and my father, who had spent 14 months being nobody's anything, looked back. I understood it. I want to be clear about that. I understood completely why a man who had loved and been loved for 30 years would reach for that feeling again when someone offered it. What I was less certain about was whether what Claudette was offering was the feeling itself or a very careful imitation of it designed to produce a specific result. I added that uncertainty to my file and said nothing and watched. They were engaged within 8 months, married within 14. I stood at that wedding in a dress I had chosen carefully and smiled in every photograph, and gave a toast that was warm and genuine, because I had made my decision, and I was keeping it. What I was also doing, though no one at the reception knew it, was watching. Claudette's son Trevor was there, 28, working in real estate, with the particular energy of a man who had learned early that charm was a tool and was still using it that way. He spent 40 minutes at the reception talking to my father's business partner about property values. He spent 20 minutes talking to my father's attorney about estate planning timelines.
He spent approximately 4 minutes talking to me. I noted all of it. I added it to the file. Then I danced with my father and told him he looked happy and meant it, because he did. The first year of their marriage was surface smooth. Claudette was attentive and organized and made my father's house look like a catalogue. She replaced the curtains and the photographs and the furniture, and I said nothing. I had made my decision. His happiness was worth more than my discomfort. That was still true, for now.
The diagnosis came in February. My father called me himself. He did not ask Claudette to make the call or send a message through anyone else. He called me directly on a Sunday afternoon and said, "Nora, I need you to tell me something and I need you to listen before you respond." I said, "Okay." He told me about the cancer. He told me the prognosis. He told me what the doctors had said about timelines and treatment options and what he had decided about both. He spoke for about 4 minutes without stopping, and when he finished, he said, "I need you to keep coming on weekends." I said, "Dad, nothing could stop me." He said, "I know, I just needed to hear you say it." What he did not say, and what I would not understand until much later, was that the diagnosis had also clarified something for him. 8 months of watching Claudette manage his illness, the phone calls she made, the questions she asked the doctors, the conversations she had with Trevor that stopped when my father entered the room, had taught him something about his wife that no amount of happiness or longing or gratitude for companionship could unlearn. He had opened his own file, and what he found inside it had changed everything he planned to leave behind. I noticed the changes in Claudette the moment the diagnosis became real. Not dramatic changes, subtle ones. The kind you only catch if you have been watching carefully for long enough. She stopped asking my father how he felt and started asking his doctors what the timeline looked like. She stopped sitting with him in the evenings and started spending those hours in his office with the door partially closed. She began referencing the house in conversations as our property in a way she had not before, a small linguistic shift that landed differently now that there was a reason for it. Trevor started visiting more frequently, every other weekend at first, then every weekend, then sometimes during the week, always with a reason that sounded legitimate and always ending up in conversations with my father about the business that my father later told me he had not initiated. I watched all of it, and I kept my voice even, and I brought my father his medication on schedule and read to him in the evenings when he was too tired to hold a book himself, and I did not say what I was thinking, because what I was thinking required evidence and not feeling. But I called my father's attorney, Margaret, on a Tuesday morning in September from my car in the hospital parking lot, and I asked her one question. I asked her whether my father had been in touch recently. She paused. Then she said, yes, quite recently. Margaret had been my father's attorney for 19 years. She had drafted his first business contracts and his first will, and every amendment to both in the decades since. She was 60. Precise, and had the particular calm of someone who had seen every version of a family in crisis and had stopped being surprised by any of it. When I asked her whether my father had been in touch, she did not tell me what they had discussed, because she could not, and I did not ask her to. What she did say, carefully, and without crossing any line, was that my father was a thorough man, and that thorough men rarely reached out to their attorneys without a reason, and that whatever his reason was, she was confident he had thought it through completely. That was all she said. It was enough. I drove back into the hospital and sat with my father for 3 hours that afternoon. We talked about small things, the baseball team he had coached for 11 years, a fishing trip we had taken when I was 9,
The way my mother used to reorganize the kitchen cabinets every spring for reasons she could never fully explain, but which always resulted in a kitchen that worked better than it had before. He laughed at that one, a real laugh, the kind that still had its full weight even then. Before I left, he held my hand and said, "Nora, I need you to trust me." I said, "Dad, I always have." He nodded once and closed his eyes.
The last night came on a Monday. I had driven up that Friday as usual, and had not left because something in my father's breathing had changed in a way that the hospice nurse said meant we were close. Claudette was in the house. Trevor had arrived Saturday morning with a laptop bag and had spent most of the weekend in the kitchen making calls I could not quite hear. The hospice nurse moved quietly between rooms. The house had the particular stillness of a place holding its breath. My father was awake for portions of that last day, not consistently. He surfaced and submerged the way people do at the end, present for a few minutes and then somewhere else entirely. During one of his clearer periods in the late afternoon, he asked me to help him sit up. I did. He looked at me for a long moment with the eyes of a man who has decided to say the thing he has been carrying. He said, "I took care of it, Nora." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "Everything I found out, everything she did, it is all in there. Make sure Margaret reads every word out loud, every single word." I squeezed his hand. He said, "Your mother would have figured it out faster than I did." Then he smiled and closed his eyes, and by Tuesday morning he was gone.
Claudette began making phone calls within 2 hours of my father's passing. I know this because I was sitting in the hallway outside his room when I heard her voice through the wall, low and rapid, the voice of someone working through a list. I could not make out every word, but I heard Trevor's name, and I heard the word attorney, and I heard the word quickly, and I filed all of it away in the particular manner I had been filing things for 3 years, and I went back into my father's room, and I sat with him in the quiet, because he deserved someone sitting with him in the quiet, and Claudette was not doing it. Margaret called me that same evening. She said my father had contacted her 6 weeks earlier and had made significant changes to his estate documents. She said he had been very specific about the will reading. He had requested that it take place within 10 days of his passing, that all named parties be present in person, and that she read every word of the document aloud, without summarizing or skipping any section, regardless of how uncomfortable it became. She said he had been very clear about that last point. Regardless of how uncomfortable it becomes, Margaret, every word. She told me she would honor his instructions completely. Then she said, "Nora, prepare yourself." I said, "I have been preparing for 3 years." She said, "I know, I could tell." The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday at Margaret's office downtown, 10 days after my father's passing, exactly as he had requested. Margaret's office was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old wood and coffee, and the particular seriousness of a place where important things were decided. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting area with my hands folded in my lap and my file open in my mind, going through everything I had collected over 3 years, the way you review notes before an exam you have been studying for longer than anyone knows. Claudette arrived with Trevor and a man I did not recognize, who turned out to be her own attorney, a young, sharp-suited man named Davis, who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been told this would be straightforward.
They sat across from me. Claudette was wearing black, which was appropriate, and a diamond bracelet, which was my father's, which she had not been wearing at the funeral, and which I noted without expression. Trevor nodded at me. I nodded back. Davis opened his briefcase and arranged papers on the table with the efficiency of a man expecting to leave within the hour. Margaret entered, sat down, opened the document, and said, "We will begin."
Margaret read the opening sections in a measured tone of a woman who has read 1,000 documents and treats each one with equal seriousness, regardless of what is inside it. The preliminary language, the identification of parties, the confirmation of my father's mental competency at the time of signing, which had been witnessed by 2 independent witnesses and a notary, and which Margaret noted had been specifically documented with a physician's statement confirming my father's full cognitive clarity 6 weeks before his death. Davis shifted slightly in his seat at that, not dramatically, just a small adjustment, the kind a person makes when something lands that they had not expected to need to account for. Claudette sat with her hands folded and her expression composed. She had the particular stillness of a woman who has been told by her attorney that the numbers are in her favor and is simply waiting for the confirmation to arrive. Trevor had his phone face down on the table. His jaw was set with the anticipation of someone who has already mentally spent something that has not yet been handed to him. I watched them both and kept my face neutral and waited for Margaret to reach the section my father had told me to listen for.
The first surprise came 12 minutes into the reading. Margaret reached the section concerning the business, Callahan Construction, 40 employees, 3-county reputation, 11 years of a man's absolute best work, built into every contract and every relationship and every decision made, with a cooler lunch and an 11-year-old truck. My father had established a management trust for the business 18 months earlier, before the diagnosis, before any of this. The trust placed operational control in the hands of his long-time business partner, Gerald Marsh, no relation to Claudette, and a board of 3 independent directors. The business was not part of the estate. It had never entered the estate. It existed in its own legal structure, entirely separate from anything Claudette or Trevor or Davis had been calculating. Davis leaned forward. He said, "I was not informed of this structure." Margaret said, "It was established before your client's marriage and was not required to be disclosed as marital property under the terms of the prenuptial agreement." Davis said, "There was a prenuptial agreement." It was not a question. It was the sound of a man realizing the room he was standing in was not the room he had been told he was walking into. Margaret said, "Yes, signed by both parties 14 months ago. Shall I read that section next, or continue with the will?" Claudette's composure shifted by exactly 1 degree.
The prenuptial agreement was 4 pages. Margaret read every word as my father had instructed. It was precise and thorough, in the way of a document drafted by someone who had been thinking carefully for a long time about exactly what needed to be protected and why. It outlined Claudette's entitlement in the event of my father's death with specificity that left no room for interpretation. The marital home, which my father had owned outright before their marriage, was not included in the marital estate. The business was not included. The investment accounts established before the marriage were not included. What Claudette was entitled to under the agreement was a specific sum, generous by any reasonable standard, and a period of continued residence in the house not to exceed 6 months from the date of my father's passing. Trevor's phone was no longer face down on the table. He had picked it up and was staring at it the way people stare at screens when they need something to look at that is not the room they are currently in.
Davis was writing notes with the focused energy of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about a situation. Claudette had not moved. She was still composed. She was a fast thinker, and she was already somewhere ahead of this moment, working out what came next. But her bracelet hand had moved to her lap where I could no longer see it, and I noted that too.
Then Margaret reached the section my father had told me about, the section he had said to listen for, the section that explained why he had been so specific about every word being read aloud in a room where everyone was present. She paused before it, a brief pause, less than a second, the pause of a woman who has read this before and is giving the room one last moment of its current shape before she changes it permanently. Then she began. "It is my wish," my father had written, "that the following findings be read into the record of this proceeding and entered as an attachment to this will, so that they may constitute part of the permanent public record of my estate. During the period of my illness, I became aware of a series of actions taken by my wife, Claudette Marsh Callahan, and her son, Trevor Marsh, that I believe constitute a deliberate attempt to gain control of assets to which they had no legal entitlement. I have documented these actions to the best of my ability with the assistance of counsel, and I am including that documentation here so that those present may understand the full context of the decisions I have made in this document." The room was completely silent. Davis had stopped writing. Trevor had put his phone face down again. Claudette had gone very still, in the way of someone who has just heard a sound they cannot place and is waiting to identify it.
My father had been thorough. I want to say that again because it is the thing that matters most about what came next. Robert Callahan had spent 8 months dying, and he had used a portion of that time, quietly and without telling anyone, to document what he had observed and what Margaret had helped him verify through legal and financial channels available to him as the owner of record of his own assets. He had kept notes, dated entries in a leather notebook Margaret now produced as an exhibit, his handwriting, precise and familiar, the same handwriting that had signed my birthday cards and my college tuition checks and 37 years of business contracts. The entries began 4 months into the illness. They documented conversations Trevor had initiated about the business valuation. They documented phone calls Claudette had made to a real estate agent about the house while my father was at a chemotherapy appointment. They documented a meeting Trevor had arranged with a commercial property developer without my father's knowledge, using Callahan construction letterhead that Trevor had no authority to use. They documented 2 separate occasions on which Claudette had contacted my father's bank to inquire about account access procedures in the event of incapacitation. Each entry was dated. Each entry had been cross-referenced by Margaret against verifiable records. None of it was feeling. All of it was fact.
Davis requested a pause in the reading. Margaret said my father's instructions did not include provision for pauses, in that she intended to honour his instructions. Davis said he needed to confer with his client. Margaret said he was welcome to confer after the reading was complete. She said it in the tone of a woman who has been an attorney for 30 years and has encountered every variety of objection and has stopped finding any of them novel. Then she continued reading. The documentation included a section my father had titled, for clarity, Actions Regarding the Power of Attorney. 3 months into his illness, Claudette had presented my father with a document granting her broad power of attorney over his financial affairs. She had told him it was a standard form recommended by their financial advisor. My father had signed it.
What he had not known at the time, and what he discovered 6 weeks before his death when Margaret reviewed the document at his request, was that the form was not standard and had not been recommended by their financial advisor, who confirmed in writing that he had never seen it before. It had been prepared by a different attorney entirely, one with a prior professional relationship with Trevor Marsh, and it contained language that would have given Claudette, and by extension Trevor, effective control over assets the prenuptial agreement had specifically excluded.
Davis requested a pause in the reading. Margaret said my father's instructions did not include provision for pauses, in that she intended to honour his instructions. Davis said he needed to confer with his client. Margaret said he was welcome to confer after the reading was complete. She said it in the tone of a woman who has been an attorney for 30 years and has encountered every variety of objection and has stopped finding any of them novel. Then she continued reading. The documentation included a section my father had titled, for clarity, Actions Regarding the Power of Attorney. 3 months into his illness, Claudette had presented my father with a document granting her broad power of attorney over his financial affairs. She had told him it was a standard form recommended by their financial advisor. My father had signed it. What he had not known at the time, and what he discovered 6 weeks before his death when Margaret reviewed the document at his request, was that the form was not standard and had not been recommended by their financial advisor, who confirmed in writing that he had never seen it before. It had been prepared by a different attorney entirely, one with a prior professional relationship with Trevor Marsh, and it contained language that would have given Claudette, and by extension Trevor, effective control over assets the prenuptial agreement had specifically excluded.
My father had revoked the power of attorney the same week he discovered what it actually said. He had done it quietly, through Margaret, with documentation that established the revocation clearly in the public record. Claudette had not been informed of the revocation. She had been operating for 6 weeks under the assumption that the document was still valid. Several of the inquiries she had made to the bank during that period, the ones my father had documented in his notebook, had been made on the basis of an authority that had already been legally extinguished. Margaret noted this in her reading with the precision of someone placing a fact on a table and stepping back to let the room look at it. Trevor stood up. He said this was inappropriate and that the will reading was not the proper venue for these kinds of allegations. Margaret said that the venue had been determined by the man whose will it was, and that his instructions had been explicit, and that she was following them. She said it without raising her voice by a single degree. Trevor said he intended to contest the validity of this entire proceeding. Margaret said he was welcome to do so through the appropriate legal channels, and that in the meantime she would be completing the reading as instructed. She looked at the document, she found her place, she continued. Trevor sat back down.
Claudette spoke for the first time since the reading began. Her voice was controlled, but the control was visible now, the kind you can see working underneath a surface like a current. She said, Robert was not well at the end. She said it carefully, the way you say something you have prepared to say, the opening line of a strategy you have been holding in reserve. She said his husband had been affected by the medication and the illness, and that she had only been trying to protect him, and that these documents did not reflect the man she had known and loved. Margaret looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. She said, Your husband specifically anticipated this characterization. Then she turned back to the document and read the section my father had titled, Regarding My Competency.
In it, he had noted the date and content of every conversation with his oncologist during the final months. He had included a signed statement from his physician confirming that his cognitive function remained unimpaired throughout his illness, and that his final decisions had been made with full clarity and full understanding of their implications. He had included a statement from Margaret herself, prepared contemporaneously, confirming the same. He had included a statement from 2 independent witnesses who had been present at the final signing. He had left no door open. Every door was accounted for and closed.
Claudette spoke for the first time since the reading began. Her voice was controlled, but the control was visible now, the kind you can see working underneath a surface like a current. She said, "Robert was not well at the end." She said it carefully, the way you say something you have prepared to say, the opening line of a strategy you have been holding in reserve. She said his husband had been affected by the medication and the illness, and that she had only been trying to protect him, and that these documents did not reflect the man she had known and loved. Margaret looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. She said, "Your husband specifically anticipated this characterization." Then she turned back to the document and read the section my father had titled, "Regarding my competency." In it, he had noted the date and content of every conversation with his oncologist during the final months. He had included a signed statement from his physician confirming that his cognitive function remained unimpaired throughout his illness, and that his final decisions had been made with full clarity and full understanding of their implications. He had included a statement from Margaret herself, prepared contemporaneously, confirming the same. He had included a statement from 2 independent witnesses who had been present at the final signing. He had left no door open. Every door was accounted for and closed. The final section of the will addressed the distribution of the estate. Margaret read it in the same measured tone she had used for everything that preceded it, giving no word more weight than another, letting the language do its own work. The marital home was to be sold, and the proceeds distributed according to the terms of the prenuptial agreement. Claudette's specified sum released to her within 30 days, the remainder placed in trust. Claudette's period of continued residence was set at the minimum the agreement allowed, 60 days rather than 6 months, a reduction my father had specified was a direct consequence of the actions documented earlier in the document. The investment accounts, the personal savings, the assets accumulated over 37 years of lunches packed in a cooler and a truck driven for 11 years past its reasonable life, all of it went to me, not a portion, not a share, all of it, held in a trust Margaret administered, structured to protect it from any legal challenge for a period of 5 years. My father had thought about that, too. He had thought about the challenge coming before the dust settled, and he had built a wall around what he was leaving me that would take more in legal fees to assault than it contained to win, which meant the assault would never come, because Trevor Marsh was many things, but he was not stupid about money.
There was one more section, a personal one. Margaret said my father had asked her to read it last, and she was going to honour that request. She cleared her throat once, the only sign of anything else than professional composure she had shown in the entire proceeding, and she read, "To my daughter Nora, you have been the best thing I built in my life, and I built some things I was proud of. Your mother knew that before I did, the way she knew most things before I did, and she would want me to make sure you heard it clearly from me at least once. I am sorry it took me longer than it should have to see what was happening in my own house.
I am sorry you watched it and said nothing because you loved me, and I know that is exactly what you did because I know you. The file you kept, Nora, I kept one too. Turns out we are more alike than either of us ever said out loud. Take care of the business. Gerald will help you. Trust Margaret. And take the fishing trip we kept talking about. Take it for both of us. I love you. I have always loved you. Dad. I did not cry during the reading. I had promised myself I would not, and I kept that promise. But my hands were shaking under the table, and I let them shake, because some things you cannot hold completely still, and that is all right.
Davis requested an immediate adjournment after the conclusion of the reading. Margaret granted it. The three of them, Claudette and Trevor and Davis, left the conference room and went into the hallway, and I could hear the low, rapid exchange of people recalculating everything at once. I stayed in my seat. Margaret poured me a glass of water and set it in front of me and sat back down across the table and did not say anything, because she understood that what I needed in that moment was not words. After about 10 minutes, Margaret said, "Your father prepared for every contingency." I said, "I know." She said, "The documentation he assembled regarding the power of attorney is significant. It has been referred to the appropriate authorities as of this morning." I looked at her. She said, "He asked me to do that before the reading. He wanted it on record before anyone in that hallway had the opportunity to get ahead of it." I thought about my father in his last weeks, sick and tired, and still working through his list, still methodical, still thorough, still the man who drove the same truck for 11 years and knew every employee by the names of their children, building one last thing before he left, making sure it held. The legal proceedings moved on their own schedule, the way legal proceedings always do, slowly and without drama, and with the particular momentum of a process that does not need anyone's permission to continue once it has started. The referral Margaret had filed regarding the power of attorney was taken up by the relevant authorities within 2 weeks. The fabricated document, the one presented to my father as a standard form recommended by his financial adviser, was examined by people whose job is to examine such things, and their findings were not favourable to the people who had produced it. Trevor's involvement was documented through the prior professional relationship between the attorney who had drafted the form and Trevor's own real estate dealings, a thread that unravelled in the particular way that threads unravel when someone with authority starts pulling. I was not involved in that process beyond providing the documentation my father had assembled. I handed it to the people who needed it, and I stepped back and I let the system do what systems do when they are handed clean and organized facts by a thorough man who anticipated exactly this moment and prepared for it accordingly. Davis withdrew from representing Claudette within 3 weeks of the reading. People who withdraw that quickly have usually seen something that tells them the ground is not where their client said it was.
Claudette moved out of the house on the 43rd day of her 60-day allowance. I know the exact day because Margaret tracked it and informed me. She left in 2 moving trucks on a Tuesday morning. I was not there. I had no desire to witness it and no need to. The house was already mine in every legal sense and would become mine in every practical sense the moment she left, and neither of those things required my presence at her departure. What she left behind surprised me, not in a good way or a bad way, just in the way that reveals character. She had taken everything she had brought into the house and a number of things she had not. Several items that had belonged to my mother were missing. A clock from the mantel that my grandmother had brought from Ireland, 2 pieces of jewellery that had been my mother's and that I had assumed was safely stored, a box of photographs, the originals, the ones she had taken down from the walls 3 years earlier and replaced with catalogue prints that I had expected to find in the attic and did not. Margaret documented everything, added it to the file my father had started and I had inherited along with everything else.
I called Gerald the week after Claudette left. Gerald Marsh, my father's business partner of 22 years, the man my father had trusted with operational control of Callahan Construction, answered on the first ring the way he always did, because Gerald believed that not answering a ringing phone was a form of disrespect to the person calling. He said, "Nora, I have been waiting for you to call." I said, "I know." He said, "Your father told me everything 6 weeks before he passed. He said he wanted me to tell you that the business is in good shape and that there is a place in it for you if you want it, and that if you do not want it, he will understand from wherever he is, but that he hopes you will at least consider it." I had worked in urban planning for 9 years. I was good at it. I understood systems and structures and the way things are built to last. My father had known this about me the same way he had known most things about me, quietly and without making a production of it. I sat with Gerald's offer for 2 weeks. I thought about my father's truck and his cooler lunch and the 40 employees whose children's names he knew. I thought about what it meant to be handed something that a person spent their whole life building and trusted you with specifically because they believed you understood its value. Then I called Gerald back and I said yes.
The investigation into the power of attorney took 7 months. I will not detail every step because the steps belong to a process that was never mine to control, only mine to initiate by handing the right documents to the right desk and then stepping back. What I will tell you is the outcome, because the outcome is the part that matters, and the part my father had planned for with the same thoroughness he brought to everything else. Trevor Marsh was found to have been materially involved in the preparation of the fraudulent document. The attorney who had drafted it cooperated with investigators in the particular way of people who have realized that cooperation is the only remaining asset they have left to offer. Trevor faced civil liability for his role, and the real estate business he had been operating received scrutiny it had not previously received and did not benefit from receiving. Claudette faced separate civil proceedings related to the items removed from the house that had not belonged to her, including my mother's clock, my mother's jewellery, and the box of original photographs that a process server eventually located in a storage unit registered in Trevor's name. The photographs came back. That mattered more to me than any dollar figure attached to any proceeding.
Margaret called me on the day the civil matters were resolved with the same measured tone she used for everything. She said, "Your father's estate is fully settled." She said, "The documentation he assembled was the foundation of everything that followed." She said, "I have practiced law for 30 years and I have rarely seen a client prepare as thoroughly as Robert did in those final weeks." I said, "He had a list." She said, "I know, he showed it to me." Item 7 was, "Make sure Nora is protected." Item 8 was, "Make sure the people who tried to take what was not theirs understand exactly what they took and what it cost them." She paused. He was very clear about item 8. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. My father, in his last months, working through his list. Item 7, Item 8. A man who was running out of time and spent some of what remained making sure that the people he loved were standing on solid ground after he was gone. He could not stop being sick. He could not negotiate with the cancer any more than anyone can. But he could be thorough.
He could document and verify and instruct and prepare. He could build one last thing before the building was done. And he did. He always did.
I took the fishing trip in April, 6 months after my father passed, on a weekend that would have been his 63rd birthday. I drove the 4 hours to the lake we had always gone to, the same one from the photograph that used to hang in the hallway before Claudette replaced it with a catalogue print. I rented the same kind of boat we used to rent. I brought the same kind of sandwiches my mother used to make for those trips, the ones with the mustard on both sides, because my father believed mustard on both sides was the correct way, and my mother had agreed with him on this point, if on few others related to food. I sat on the water for most of the day, and I caught 2 fish and released them both, because my father always said the keeping was less interesting than the catching, and I had always privately agreed with him, though I had never told him so. I thought about the photograph, about the 2 of us holding up that unexpected catch, about the laugh I could still feel the shape of, even though I could not remember what it was about. I thought about item 7 on his list. I thought about the leather notebook. I thought about a man who spent his last weeks sick and tired and still building something for the person he loved most. Then I drove home, and I went to work, and I took care of what he had left me to take care of.
The house sold in June. I did not keep it. I had considered it, spent several evenings walking through the rooms trying to feel whether it was mine or whether it was just a place my father had lived that Claudette had turned into something else. The rooms where my mother's photographs had hung felt like outlines, shapes where things had been. I could have put the photographs back, the ones that came back from the storage unit, and I did put some of them back temporarily just to see, but the house had been reorganized around an absence, the same way my father had been reorganized around my mother's absence, and I was not the person to fill either one. I kept the photograph from the hallway, the fishing trip one. I had it reframed and put it in my office at Callahan Construction, on the wall beside my desk, where I can see it from my chair. My father on the left, me on the right, both of us holding up something neither of us expected, both of us laughing at something I will never remember and will always feel. Gerald came in the first week I was in the office and looked at it for a long moment and said, "He talked about that trip all the time." I said, "I know." Gerald said, "He talked about you all the time." I said, "I know that too. I just did not always let myself believe it." Gerald said, "Believe it." Then he went back to his office, and we both went to work.